Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. And today we are going to tier rank every single skill available to characters in D&D 5e.
Skills are one of the most important pillars of D&D, and they define how good your character is at doing things in the world that they're playing in. And some skills come up quite a bit, and others don't come up very often at all. Today, Monty and I are going to share our review of what we think the most useful skills in the game are. This is dependent on your DM and the table that you're playing at, but we have found in our years of playing that these are the skills that are most useful.
And so we're going to be ranking the skills based on which skills it's most useful to have multiple characters in the party proficient in. Because obviously one character can't be proficient in every skill unless we've actually done a couple videos about how many can you get, so you can check that out. But across the party, is it useful to have multiple characters proficient in the same skills? Do you only need one or two? Or what ones can you get away with nobody being proficient in? There's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
Before we jump into these skills this week, we want to talk about something that we've been putting all of our skills into, and that is writing our third book, which is now live on Kickstarter.
Monsters of Drakkenheim features 150 new monsters for 5th edition, drawn from the dark fantasy world of eldritch horror Drakkenheim, which our actual play campaigns have taken place in. We have gone back over the many years of our actual play campaign and statted up fully every monster from the show so that you can use them to terrorize your player characters and test their skills.
Not only are we introducing a bunch of old and new monsters from our show and from our imagination, we are also putting in rules for epic bosses, which we also did a video about. We have a brand new crafting system, which we also did a video about. And we have a bunch of new conditions that we're looking at, which I think we also did a video about.
And speaking of skills, every one of our monster entries actually has a lore section with skill tables so that players can use their knowledge and investigation skills to determine the monster's abilities in the middle of combat so they can get the edge to survive battle against them.
So if you're interested in getting more eldritch horrors for your game, as well as brand new rule systems and a whole bunch of fun conditions and epic boss rules and a new crafting system, please check the links in the description below to make sure that you get on the Kickstarter while it is still active. We are nearing the end, so now's the best chance for you to get in on this Kickstarter. But now, let's start talking about the skills in D&D. Up on screen right now, you're going to see the rankings that we use to determine how amazing these skills are and whether they're useful. Right away at S tier, these are skills that are extremely useful and powerful. You're going to want at least one person who is really good at this skill, and that's going to make a huge difference in your game. You're probably going to want more than one, though. Every character can benefit from proficiency in this skill, and it's an ideal choice for expertise.
Now, the A tier skills are useful and effective. Not every character in your party needs to be proficient in it, but you definitely want a few characters who are able to use the skill and have a really good bonus in it. It's a really worthwhile option for expertise for characters that have that choice.
Now, as we look at B tier, these ones are situationally useful, but still relatively essential. You're going to want at least one character in the party who's decent at it.
C tier, on the other hand, is much more niche. These skills are cool when they come up and it's handy to have them, but they probably won't come up very often unless the characters take steps to actively use this. You'll be fine as long as one character is proficient in it, but they don't even need a really great bonus in these skills to get the most out of them.
Finally, D tier is going to be for the skills that are rarely needed, probably not worth anyone in the party being proficient in, unless it's for their character build or the concept requires that. There are some builds in the game that say, hey, you should probably be proficient in this skill. Some of the D tiers might fall into that category. In most situations, though, the party will be able to rely on buffs or gaining advantage or having good ability scores that will allow them to power through most checks with these skills.
So kicking things off, we're going to take it alphabetically down the character sheet. Start off with Acrobatics. Acrobatics is a dexterity-based skill, and in my estimation, it is the definition of a B tier skill. It's useful for the characters who are proficient in it. You want one or two people who are going to be able to handle the skill challenges where acrobatic performance is relevant. It can be useful for getting out of grapples and stuff like that, but beyond that, nobody is ever going to die because their character wasn't proficient in acrobatics. Unless it's like that rare situation where you're like balancing on an icy beam over a giant pit, in which case send the rogue across and hopefully they can pull a lever on the other side.
When I think of acrobatics, it falls into this category of skills that I wish was more useful, and acrobatics I find is actually confusing to separate from athletics. One thing that we talk about often is I try to flavor text my jumping in a way that, say, instead of doing a regular jump, I'm doing a flip or a cartwheel.
Yeah.
Just to try to be like, give me an acrobatics check instead of an athletics check. And when you think of people who are really, really good at acrobatics, they're often really athletic as well. And so the separation of these two skills is complicated because one is for sort of flipping and balancing and moving, while the other one is for the actual strength.
It's like, what skill would you use for parkour?
And parkour, I argue, is acrobatics, but you need to be strong and athletic in order to do parkour. But that's the same as anybody in Cirque du Soleil.
Yeah.
It's like you would call that acrobatics.
But you still have to be strong enough to be able to hold yourself upside down under a trapeze while swinging back and forth. And like, that is strength.
Yeah.
In play, like lifting your own body up and upside down for the Cirque du Soleil performers. Like, you have to be strong even if you are a 100-pound performer.
And so I think that acrobatics falls into the B category because a lot of the things that you want to use acrobatics for are jumping and parkouring and moving, but like, depending on your DM, those can just as easily fall in athletics.
Yeah. Moving on to animal handling. This is a wisdom-based skill that is often kind of like the social interaction skill for animals. It often gets used up a lot when you are trying to control a mount or calm a wild animal down, which those are interesting scenarios. I can count on one hand the number of times they usually happen in a campaign. They're not uncommon, but they're pretty rare, and oftentimes characters have made those checks raw just fine with buffs, or have used another spell like Speak with Animals or Charm Animals to get through it instead.
One of my favorite moments in our campaign is when my character Wilhelm jumped on top of a wyvern that was chained up, cut the chains, and then spent 3 or 4 turns trying to wrangle control of it. I wasn't proficient in animal handling. I had to make animal handling checks, but based on my just raw wisdom, I had like a +2. And so I rolled until I managed it. The characters who I think would take proficiency in animal handling are rangers and druids, but they also have access to a lot of spells that make animal handling less useful. Druids have speak with animals or the ability to calm beasts or befriend beasts, or all of that's kind of baked into their spell progression and their abilities. So do they really need animal handling?
And we'll get into it later, but sometimes the DM will be merciful and let you make a nature check or a survival check, or even make a social check to persuade the animal. So
if you have speak with animals, it becomes less animal handling and more persuasion.
Yeah, it's weird. So honestly, I really think it's a big waste for a character to use one of their precious skill proficiencies to get proficiency in this skill.
Again, I give it a D tier, but I want to put a little asterisk there that in D tier we said unless it's kind of demanded by your build or concept. If I'm playing a druid, I might take animal handling, but that's just because I want to live that flavor.
It's for the role play, but like, you're taking that skill that like every time you're going to use that skill, you're just going to use the spell instead.
True.
Yeah. Arcana, on the other hand, this skill is pretty essential. I think that every campaign involves some notion that the characters are interacting with magic, magical phenomena, and they want to understand how they work. And what I see in practice is that Arcana is gets used less and less as a arcane lore skill, and more frequently I see Arcana used as this is the disabled device or thieves' tools skill for magic. So it's like the skill that you use for operating a magical ritual or device or magic item, identifying a magical effect that isn't necessarily a spell or is a spell. And that means it just comes up all the time.
I also think Arcana is sort of the magical investigation. Rather than rolling investigation, a lot of times if you're investigating a magical phenomenon, what is happening, what magic was cast in this area that caused whatever occurred? What is this magical field I'm standing before? In order to decipher these things, we often ask for an Arcana check. And in my opinion, that makes it the most useful intelligence-based skill. I'm giving Arcana an A tier because it's not as useful as some of the S tier options that we're looking at, but out of the intelligence-based skills, it's going to come up a lot. You want at least one person who's proficient, if not expertise.
Yeah, I think that's the whole thing of why it's A tier, not S tier, is that as long as you have one character that is really, really good at Arcana, you're fine. You get really strong diminishing returns with having multiple characters proficient in Arcana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As we move on to athletics, though, this literally falls into the same category as acrobatics.
I agree.
It's useful for your strong guy. But you really only need one person who can lift and pull and push things and jump really far. And then the question on whether the things that you're doing fall into acrobatics or athletics, it's going to help you get out of grapples, which makes it B tier because it's useful in those situations.
I would say that athletics might be almost falling into the C tier, though, because a lot of the times athletics and just raw strength checks or raw strength saving throws often get merged together. Like, it's not clear, do you make an athletics check to lift up a heavy thing? Like, is a deadlift an athletics check? Or is it just a strength check?
So here's the thing. As a DM, I always default to asking for an athletics check because there's two possibilities there. One, the character is not proficient in athletics, in which case I'm really just asking for a strength check.
Yeah.
Or they are proficient in athletics, in which case I'm giving the player the opportunity to play into the thing.
Because there is a skill even to lifting up heavy objects. There are ways to leverage the mechanical advantages of your body, even when you're picking up something heavy. And so I find that fine. Your jump distance is a fixed number in D&D 5e. Like, it is your strength score. So athletics only comes into play when you're trying to exceed that jump distance.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, it is a lower B, but I'm still comfortable leaving it B.
Well, we move on to deception, the lying skill. And there's something really important about deception that makes it one of the best social skills in the game. And that is that the immediate idea between deception, persuasion, and intimidation is that deception is lying, lying is bad, persuasion is the righteous skill.
But is it bad when you lie to bad people?
This is the thing, is deception actually is so useful for what I would argue is one of the favorite tropes in D&D. And that is the sneaking into the Death Star trope. It's the disguising the Wookiee up as a prisoner, putting on the costumes of the guards, and lying your way into the place you need to be. Lying comes up all the time in D&D. We lie to the guards to sneak into the castle. We lie to the villains to be like, you're surrounded, when really they're not. It comes up often.
Frodo lied about having the ring.
Yeah.
Right? So many times, right? People lied about, you lie who you are when you're pretending to be somebody else, right? And so it's such a common thing, and it's such an advantage because, generally speaking, when you're using persuasion, you're trying to negotiate with someone in good faith. And so you're not necessarily negotiating with you might be negotiating with an enemy, But with an enemy, you might be willing to just lie to them to get what you want out of that situation. And I also think that deception has so much room for player creativity. It's very open-ended in the ways that it works. It is an opposed roll, so oftentimes deception, you get your way just by rolling high. And deception is one of those other things where I think it's S tier because the more people who are in on a lie, the more effective that lie becomes. Because that is the number one way to suss out a lie, is ask the accomplice, is that true? And oftentimes it's the weakest link in the chain that is the one that spills the beans.
That's 100% true. If you want multiple people with deception.
Yeah.
Because if the person doing the talking is like, yeah, our rogue is dead. He's not here to assassinate you. And they're like, really? And you roll on deception, and then they turn to the fighter and they're like, is the rogue dead? And he's like, no. And it's like, well, you just blew it. But if he's like, yeah, of course, and then all of a sudden sneak attack from the rafters, it's better to have more people who can sell the lie. Deception is S tier.
Yeah, absolutely. History. So there is this phrase that goes, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But to quote XKCD, all a degree in it gets you is 40 years of teaching it.
Okay, I admit before I say this that this is not the best DMing from young DM Kelly. But my problem with history is that every time that I used to ask for history, it was because I wanted to lore dump. Yeah. And then they'd roll, and if they rolled like a 3, I'd be like, well, too bad, I'm lore dumping anyway.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. It's like history is often used to give the players an essential clue, which you should just give them. Or sometimes history is about the mystery, and knowing the player rolling a nat 20 and getting like a 30 on their history check, well, now the mystery is spoiled because the player read that obscure book.
Like if a character walks up to a statue and is like, do I know what this is a statue of? I don't feel like they should roll for that. The answer is yes or no. It's like, yeah, because either I as a DM is like, oh, you're asking about the statue? I've been excited to tell you. Or I, as a DM, am like, no, you're gonna, like, I would ask for an investigation.
It's just, it feels bad when you don't get the cool lore. When it's like failing a history check means now you don't get the cool story.
I find that the knowledge checks in general are difficult in D&D, and we can talk about that as we wrap up the episode. But I think history is D.
History is also too broad, right? Like, someone who is an expert. Like, people are not necessarily experts in world history. You have a person who is an expert in ancient Roman history and a person who is an expert in Chinese history. And in fact, you might have someone who is an expert in a very specific, like, 20-year period. Like, they can tell you everything about this dynasty and that period. Someone who is an expert in, like, there are literally people who get PhDs just in Victorian era studies. And because the amount of information around that period is so dense. And so in my opinion, the history skill shouldn't exist, and it should be treated like a tool proficiency. And like, maybe if you're an elf, you are proficient in elf lore. And if you are a dwarf, you have dwarf lore. And then there are different like areas of knowledge, and like a character has like a handful of these different histories because it's just too broad.
They should, next to tool proficiencies, we should have knowledge proficiencies, and you should choose them like you do tools.
And I do know that like Pathfinder 2nd Edition has done like a lore sort of thing, and I think that is a cool inroad to it where instead of having history be a skill on its own and knowledge skills in general working like a tool proficiency, I think would work way better than having them be skilled.
The only character I took history proficiency in was Wilhelm, and that was because we were writing Sebastian Crows, and I wanted an in-game reason for my character to be able to dump lore that I was writing. So my reasoning is that he spent his childhood reading, and so I get to say things that might be meta.
Yeah, and also the other thing, just my like soapbox rant, and then I'm done, is like history is a very imperfect thing, and history, the truth of history varies on who is telling the story. And if you look at the way that we understand history in the real world, like within a human lifetime, it starts to get really, really messy. And even there's a bunch of historical information that is unknown about people that are still alive today. And so in D&D worlds, like making a history check on like something that happened 3,000 years ago.
Are we sure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I do think that there's more need for nuance here.
All right, stepping off the soapbox, though,
Yeah.
into insight. Insight falls into the category, this comes up a few times in this episode for me, skills that I think could be utilized better, and if they were, would perform better.
Yep.
Insight is wrongfully used as a lie detector that players generally instigate. Players say, I would like to make an insight check. I mean, it was hilarious, but there's even the moment in our show where we had Ginny D as a guest, and you were like saying something and she yelled, insight check, which was great.
Yeah.
But that is unfortunately how insight is used. Instead of, I much prefer to see insight as almost in LA Noire when you were investigating somebody and you had like the options where you had to kind of dismantle and determine which avenue of talking to them was going to get you the best result. I almost think that insight should help you know whether intimidation, persuasion, or deception will work best, or whether or not, here's an example. I roll insight on a character because I'm like, what's the best angle to approach this person? And the DM says, you notice that they're wearing a ton of jewelry, gold, lavish outfits. It really seems like they respond well to flattery and money.
Well, this is where I think, one of the things that we like to get in the habit of in our published books is we do personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws for all of our NPCs and in our published books. And I try to get into the habit of doing that with all of my NPCs as well. And I think that this is why it would be so beneficial if these were baked in as part of the stat block, because if an NPC's role-playing traits were just part of its stat block, then an insight check could tell you what those role-playing traits are by reading them in some way. And so like, yeah, you figure out, okay, their personality trait. And like one of the things that could be cool is like maybe a character's bond is something really secret. So that is the highest DC. Or maybe like one of the things is something that you just can't learn. That's too much of a secret. One of them is the lower DC and one of them is like the medium DC. And the higher insight check gives you more about the really harder to suss out personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws.
Now that you're saying that, it seems obvious that we could put just DCs next to
yes, exactly. Like the personality trait could maybe be the DC 10. The ideal could be DC and maybe the flaw, depending on how obvious the flaw is, because it doesn't need to be a firm system. It doesn't need to be that knowing the flaw is always DC 20, because some people, their flaws are stupidly obvious. Yeah. Some people, though, are much more guarded about what motivates them. And so you could assign a DC to each of the individual role-playing traits, and then the insight check tells you what the role-playing trait is.
As it is used, though, insight, I think, does land in a B category, where because it can still be pretty useful and you want somebody who's good at it.
And it's not mind reading. And it is. It's useful to have somebody with it, unless Monty's your DM, in which case, if I'm DMing, don't bother taking insight.
And speaking of Monty being your DM and don't bother taking it, we move on to intimidation. Intimidation, once again, a skill that, because Monty is my DM, I have gained proficiency in multiple characters, and it doesn't come up very often. And I understand. We've talked about this, and your reasoning makes sense. Deception, the reason why deception gets an S tier is because it's broadly applicable.
Yeah.
There are a million instances where deception is going to come into play. Intimidation is one thing and one thing only. You are threatening a person. And I think that is where I now that that's clear to me, I understand it. I think I was using intimidation like kind of like concealed threats. Like, you better do what I say because I'm a spellcaster. And you're like, okay, roll persuasion. And I'm like, but I was intimidating. You're like, were you? And so,
were you, Kelly?
No, I don't know how to be intimidating.
Yeah. To me, intimidation is issuing somebody a real and truthful threat of usually physical violence, but or some kind of consequence. If you do not do X, I am going to do Y. And so it is a threat.
Not Y.
Yeah, no, if you don't do X, I'm going to do Y.
That's terrible.
And if you really make me mad, I'm going to do Z.
Oh, no. The fact that it's Z and not Z, we're Canadian, Monty. Why are you using Z on me?
That's the point.
Oh, no.
And so intimidation also, when you use it, it immediately puts you in an automatically antagonistic and almost belligerent mode with whoever you're using it on. And even when you successfully intimidate somebody, their disposition towards you is going to be damaged thereafter because of the fear that you've used. And so they might be more likely to comply with you, but they also are just as equally likely to avoid you and not want to help you in the future.
The intimidation skill is about as useful as the friends cantrip, where it's like you can convince somebody to do something, but they know that you are messing with them. I also think I have the argument a lot that I think a barbarian should be able to use like strength for intimidation, because if a huge muscly person with an axe walks into a room and says, do what I say, or I'm going to cut you with an axe, I'm more likely to say yes to the big, burly, muscly guy with an axe than I am to the scrawny little guy with an axe.
So here's my argument for why that's not the case.
Okay.
Intimidation is about the threat and the person on the other end of the threat believing that if they comply, you will actually not kill them. And I think that with people who are really scary and really and physically intimidating, like an orc that says, push the button and I'll let you live. I don't actually believe that you're going to let me live. And that's the whole thing about why it's still a charisma-based skill. Is part of the art of intimidation is that the person on the other end of the threat has to believe that the threat's real, but that if they comply, you're actually going to go ahead with your side of what you say. And with someone who is scary, that's why they're not necessarily intimidating, because you're just like, no, you're terrifying, and I don't believe that you're going to let me live.
So intimidation, we're putting it a C.
I think so. Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah. And that's my little argument for why intimidation isn't necessarily yes, it could work, but I do think that strength doesn't capture that really essential part about a well-delivered threat is perceived as, oh, you're not going to just do it anyways, right? It makes the person receiving the threat go, no, they're serious about this threat, but if I cave to them, it'll be okay. And that's the kind of thing about the strength-based intimidation is that in most cases, it's more, they're still going to beat you up.
I mean, it's tricky because my final counter argument, I recently rewatched the movie The Batman.
Yeah.
And there's the difference between the intimidation of the Riddler and the intimidation of the Batman. The Batman hangs you upside down and screams at you and is like, I'm going to drop you off this building unless you tell me what, and you're like, okay, I'll say anything again, that's fear. You're terrified of the Batman.
That's also where it gets into torture. And that's also where intimidation is also about the art of making that person still give you what you want and it not just be a lie that they respond to you with. Because with a person who's being physically brutalized will just say anything to get out of that situation. Right. They're not necessarily going to do the helpful thing.
Fair.
Yeah.
Moving on to investigation. Investigation is one of my favorite skills in the game. I think that it's really, really useful to have somebody with investigation. Yeah. The one thing is, and luckily Monty is not a DM who does this, but there are DMs out there who underuse investigation and overuse perception.
Yes.
The difference is that perception is your immediate senses. It's what you smell, what you hear, what you see, what you touch. Whatever you can interact with your senses in that instance is perception.
Use the 10-second rule, right? It's perception is about what you can take in within 10 seconds.
If I drop my food on the ground and it's there for less than 10 seconds, I'm using my perception of taste to determine if I'm eating it or not, and I am. But if it's longer than 10 seconds, I use investigation to see how much dirt is on that piece of food before I decide to eat it.
And then you use Sleight of Hand to brush it off.
Sleight of Hand, and I eat it anyway.
Yeah. And then when someone asks you, did you just eat that? You use deception to say no.
No, it was fine. It was less than 10 seconds, I'd say. And then I'd use persuasion to try to convince them that the 10-second rule actually means something.
Are you persuaded?
So investigation is a really great skill if somebody's actually looking for something, but not just like, what do I see? It's, okay, I think there might be a secret door here. I'm investigating the bookshelf to find which book I pull to open the door. Or investigation might be, there's a blood splatter. What kind of creature is this blood from?
It is the Sherlock Holmes
Yeah.
skill.
Yeah.
It is the crime scene analysis skill. And in that respect, what investigation is really good at doing in these situations is helping the player characters draw conclusions about what they see, right? I like to operate under the idea that, like, investigation is a really good candidate for a degrees of success skill. So the fact that the player is investigating a scene is going to give them a baseline of information because they're spending the time to look things around. And then the result of the skill check is going to tell them how much information they got, or might give them more context, more clues. And for me, it's not about more actual information, but me as the DM providing the player with more clues that help them understand what they're looking at. And in this respect, I think investigation is an A-tier skill.
Absolutely. I don't think you need multiple people good at investigation. Yeah. One is enough because they're the one who's going to investigate.
Yeah. In a super dungeon crawly heavy campaign, maybe it loses some stock, but I think that it only loses stock because some DMs will run that dungeon crawly heavy campaign where investigation doesn't get applied to examining the dungeon and the traps, when sometimes it really should be used for that purpose.
Next up, we come to medicine. Here's the thing with medicine.
Healing magic exists?
Healing magic exists. Medicine
exists?
The only time I've actually seen medicine be used is when a adventure book or an ability specifies that you should use a medicine check. And even then, I've never seen a character be proficient in medicine and it come up more than like once.
And we designed a whole class themed around doctors and medicine. And even then, it was hard for us to build the class around medicine and make the medicine skill itself useful and relevant, because so many of its spells and other abilities just felt like it so regularly supplanted the usefulness of the medicine skill.
If you want to talk about something that Pathfinder definitely got right, it's the way that medicine can actually heal people.
Yes. The fact that the medicine skill doesn't just have a baseline of use the medicine skill during a short rest or in combat to heal people is really disappointing. And I think for that reason, medicine often, a lot of the practical applications of medicine can get supplanted by both the nature skill and sometimes the investigation skill, right? Like, I've seen people use medicine to examine the wounds on a corpse, but I would just as easily make that investigation. I've seen people use medicine to examine for diseases or things like that, and I would also just let nature do that too. And so I do think that medicine is pretty D tier overall, and just not it's cool for flavor and role playing, but it doesn't have a lot of actual practical uses compared to other character abilities.
You bringing up using investigation to examine a body, I immediately think of Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow movie with Ichabod Crane going to the town to investigate, and he calls himself an investigator, and he examines the bodies to determine who the killer is. If somebody was running Ichabod Crane as a D&D character, it's 100% investigation.
Yeah.
He's not proficient. I mean, he might be proficient in medicine, but I argue that everything he's doing is investigative.
On the similar topic, though, nature is one of the more well-defined, but yet somehow also niche knowledge skills, because nature is really clear that it covers biology and geography. It's knowledge about animals, creatures, natural life, biomes, the weather, all those sorts of things. But it's also amazing how that doesn't necessarily come up all that much in the context of adventuring.
Nature is, in my opinion, aside from Arcana, which is a special case, nature is the second most useful of the knowledge skills, but it's a wide gap.
It is a pretty wide gap. And because nature also tends to deal with lower challenge rating monsters as well in identifying them. And so it's things like beasts, things that don't have magical powers.
Yeah.
And in a world where magic is the focus, like such a huge part of the world, it's almost like magic supplants nature in its importance in understanding it.
I feel like it's Arcana's way up at the top, then there's a huge gap, then it's nature, and then like history and religion fall under that.
Yeah.
Does that put nature, though, in the category, it is the one that's going to come up more than religion or history?
I think it's still a C tier.
Fair.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Moving along. The Big Daddy. The best skill in the game.
Perception has to be S tier.
It is S tier. We have to acknowledge in part that perception should be A tier, but the way that it is used in a lot of D&D games makes it S tier because perception is overutilized by dungeon masters who gate information they should be giving to the players in the first place behind a perception check.
Not only that, but perception is the number one skill that is most used as a group skill.
Yeah.
And for that reason, it has to be S tier because the idea of S tier is that multiple people benefit from taking it. If everybody is proficient in perception, you're just increasing the chances of getting information.
Yeah. And so, again, this is another reason why Pathfinder 2nd Edition just made perception and not skill that just everybody has. Again, with perception, it is that 10-second rule. It's like, what can your character see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and feel immediately about the environment? But more specifically, we're going to use perception not for just noticing things that are obvious to the naked eye, but more so things that are less than obvious and or hidden, right? So we would never tell a character that they need to make a perception check to see a barn door in front of them, or to see the creatures that are standing in the room, or hear people that are just talking normally. Those things are not appropriate for characters to be making perception checks. But it might be something where you want the characters to make those perception checks to notice the harder to see details, like the fact that there are cracks running through the ceiling indicating a weakened ceiling, or that the people that are talking obviously have weapons hidden underneath their clothing, right? Or that actually know there is a person back there in the dark corner kind of hiding.
I think a great example is, as a DM, you tell the players that they hear growling and footprints coming towards them. All the players can hear that. One of them rolls perception and rolls really high, and they get the information, oh no, you know what those growls are. It's not wolves, it's an owl bear.
So we're thinking about perception like we've got the snapshot photo, but perception is the zoom in and enhance, right? Yeah. Make sure you're still giving the players the whole photograph and then increase the level of detail with perception.
But it's still S tier.
Yeah.
Moving on, though, to performance. Also S tier.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Everybody should be taking performance.
Yes, exactly. My PhD in performance studies was absolutely the most important skill I've ever gained in my entire life, and it's completely S tier.
I mean, it got... okay. There's a whole argument for why your PhD is actually very useful. But... other than bards and sorry bards, we know that you want to take performance. We know that you're going to take performance. But even
everything
as a bard,
is performance. Like all human behavior is inherently performative. So performance is a skill. If you know performance, you can actually analyze basically everything.
Nobody needs the performance skill in D&D. Nobody needs it.
This is another one where I think that the performance skill should just be a tool proficiency.
Yeah, if I'm a bard and I've chosen to be proficient in the lute and
singing,
you should be able to choose singing, poetry,
dance,
And then why would I roll performance when I could just make a skill check based on the tool that I have chosen to be good at?
No, it would be way better if performance and history and knowledge more broadly, these all could very comfortably fall into the same kind of way that we treat tool proficiencies, where characters get a couple of them as part of their ancestry and their background, and maybe their class gives them a couple as well, but keep those separate from the skills. And it would make a lot more sense because unless you're a bard, performance is D tier. definitionally.
Yeah. Persuasion is our middle between intimidation and deception. It is not as applicable as deception in a D&D game, but it is far more useful than intimidation. It involves honesty, so there is actually, as much as that sounds weird to be like, honesty's tough in D&D.
Honesty is hard. Being honest with people tactfully is hard. Think of it in real life, how much harder sometimes it is to be truthful to somebody and tell them, like, it's so hard to tell people how you really feel sometimes.
Never tell me how you really feel. Just shower me in compliments.
Yeah. And this is why deception is so useful, because like we are all deceiving everybody. Like the mask, full mask on, 100% all the time. My life is a lie. But
maybe this is a neurodivergent thing that we think deception's the most useful because we have to deceive everybody to think we're normal people.
We're right here. Is this
part 3?
It's group therapy. Okay. So, persuasion though, and the other thing where persuasion is hard to use is that persuasion is more than just like, you will do what I want you to do. Persuasion is, for lack of a better term, the art of the deal. Persuasion comes from asking someone to do something for you, but then offering them either a reason or something tangible, honestly, about why they should do it. And in general, it needs to be, you should help us because it's the right thing to do, or you should help us because we're the heroes. That is the hardest persuasion reason to convince people, except in certain cases. You should help us because I'll pay you 1,000 gold if you do. Now you're speaking my language.
I mean, I think certain characters might do things because it's the right thing to do, but that, again, depends on the personality
And
traits.
sometimes you have to convince people that it is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not as obvious to other people why it is the right thing to do, and that is the art of persuading them, is that. And like, you don't have to be a real life hostage negotiator to use persuasion in a role-playing game, but you do have to be able to say what you want and what you're offering as part of the skill check.
I think it's a B.
I think it's an A.
Okay.
I think it's really like, it is an A, but it is a difficult skill to use.
What did we give
like
intimidation? Intimidation we gave C.
Yeah. Deception
we gave S. Okay. Yeah. No, you're right. Persuasion, A. I accept that.
Yeah, it's just a harder skill to use, and it's a harder skill to adjudicate. But like, when you can successfully negotiate with people in good faith, it really works.
I will say that if I'm playing a social face character, which I often do, I will usually take persuasion and deception.
Yeah. And I'll say also in general, like with persuasion, you can't make absorbent requests and expect to get what you want on a natural 20. I usually operate with a rule of 3 with persuasion, where I try to have 3 successful persuasion checks with a bit of a back and a forth negotiation before the character necessarily gets what they want. I like to kind of use it more like a bargaining skill, because first of all, I just find that makes the social scene more interesting in general at the table. And it usually gives more opportunities for more than one player character to contribute. And this is why, in principle, I like having persuasion be A tier, because I want more than one character in the party to be able to participate in the negotiation.
Yeah, you're not going to use persuasion to tell the king that you're taking over his kingdom. You're going to use persuasion to hopefully, if you land a 20 on that persuasion, the king doesn't throw you in jail.
Yeah.
Or behead you. But yeah.
Or just laugh you out of the room for making
Coming to religion.
The religion skill is interesting because it kind of is the red-headed stepchild to Arcana. And in many cases, Arcana is used in places where religion should be the skill, like with undead and outsiders like fiends and celestials.
Do you have something against redheads?
No, redheads in my estimation are absolutely S tier. But the red-headed stepchild, that is the religion skill, is kind of like, it often gets forgotten in the little corner over there, even though like it actually should be a useful skill and should be incredibly relevant, because we're living in a world of mythology and gods. Like religion, the contrast between religion and history is, the confluence point between those two things is mythology, right?
Yeah.
And when we're dealing with fantasy worlds, we're dealing with worlds that are steeped in myth. And so this is also another thing where like the religion and the history skill and the knowledge skills all get really, really weird because like, is it religion to be able to tell the story of the world's creation when the world was created by gods?
But
Right.
that could also be history because it's not.
Yeah.
It's fact
In a fantasy world where
the gods actually,
right, or where you're telling like the story of like, the gods,
the time that the angels came down and gave us gifts.
Exactly. Like history and religion are so deeply intertwined, and that is not just a statement about the real world, even though it is, but like just in general. And so this is another reason why like probably a whole bunch of the elements of the religion skill should just go in the same column as history. So much of understanding history is understanding religion and how religion works. And like fundamentally speaking, you like the Bible in Western literature, like you have to like, we had to read the Bible as part of my reading list for theater history because you have to understand what is written in that book to understand so much of what Shakespeare is actually talking about. Right?
I give religion a C.
It's just like Shakespeare uses so many references to the Greek gods as well.
Yeah.
Right? But it is fundamentally, in the context of D&D, it's a C tier skill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Moving on to Sleight of Hand, once again, falls into the category of skills that should be more useful than they are. And I think the major problem that I have with Sleight of Hand, similar to Performance, although I do think it's better than Performance, nobody other than rogues is going to take Sleight of Hand. And if they do, maybe
a bard.
And like, are you pickpocketing or are you like Indiana Jones swapping an item for another item to not trigger the trap? One thing that I think Baldur's Gate 3 did that we should all be doing. I don't think thieves' tools are necessarily what we should be rolling with. I don't think tools necessarily should be something that you roll dice with your tools. Tools should give you the ability to do certain things. But Sleight of Hand should be a more useful skill. If I have thieves' tools, it means that I have the tools to pick locks.
Yeah.
But I use Sleight of Hand to pick the locks.
Yep.
If I have smith's tools, I have the tools now to perform smithing, but maybe I use Sleight of Hand to see how good I am with my hands at smithing.
That's an interesting way of running that. Or maybe we need like a mechanics skill.
Yeah.
Right? That is like the int based.
But Sleight of Hand is not as useful as it could be.
Yeah.
But it's more useful, I think, than Performance. I feel like I'm going to give it a C tier.
Yeah. Okay. Stealth. You only need to have seen the group use Pass Without Trace and give everyone in the group plus 10 to stealth to see what happens when everyone in your party is good at stealth. Even
if you're a character who is not generally good at stealth, if you did have proficiency in stealth, you'd be more helpful to the party. We wouldn't have the Joe Gorman clunk clunk situation so often. If everybody in the party was proficient in stealth, things would go smoothly.
This is one of those things where, much like Deception, stealth kind of goes down to the lowest common denominator. Whoever is worst at the skill defines how well the group as a whole does. Now, as an individual, stealth can be great for scouting an environment out, although it's risky when you're scouting on your own. Stealth is great for setting up ambushes, for gaining surprise, which is super powerful in 5th edition. And like the infiltration scenario is just so common as a trope. And it is one of those things where the more people in your party are proficient in stealth, the more powerful the skill becomes. And even though stealth is not invisibility, Pass Without Trace shows you what happens when the entire party is good at stealth.
I think it's an S tier.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those things where it's useful both in and out of combat. It's useful in exploration, so useful in exploration because of the way stealth acts as this kind of transitionary skill between the exploration mode and the combat mode. And if you can navigate the environment that you're in with stealth and approach every combat from an advantageous position, oh boy.
I agree.
Yeah, right? There's a reason why the stealth archers are amazing in the Bethesda games.
Stealth does turn into invisibility.
Starting combat on your terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As we move on to the final skill, which is survival, I think that one of the interesting things about survival is survival doesn't necessarily know what survival is in the terms of D&D. Survival I usually use as the tracking and foraging skill. But I find that as a DM, I often say, give me a survival or a blank roll. By that, what I mean is if somebody's trying to track a creature by looking at their footprints, I say, give me a survival or an investigation roll.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody is foraging and trying to decide if the berries they're looking at are edible or poisonous, I might say, give me a survival or a nature check.
And sometimes survival and animal handling can also come up together. And sometimes even perception comes into play there. So survival is another one of those skills where like it's a weird combination of a bunch of different skills, and it could just as easily not be in the game, and all of its functions could be allocated to other skills. I kind of favor that. I kind of think that investigation could be tracking. I think that, knowledge of plants and animals can be the foraging sort of skill. And I think the game would be fine just without it. I think animal handling is the other one that I would probably axe.
Now, survival doesn't need to be a D because it is actually useful. I think it's a C, but the thing is that it's kind of a nebulous C where it's like you can use survival, but a lot of DMs are going to just also ask for other type of roles.
People want it to be useful because rangers are cool, and wilderness survival as an idea is a cool thing, right? But I just think that it's this weird hodgepodge skill that covers a bunch of things that are related thematically, but also weirdly not the same, like weirdly the same, but weirdly not. Like it is like the outdoorsman skill.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just too broad in that respect. Yeah.
So as we wrap this all up, I think what this video ended up being was not only us tier ranking the skills, but us discussing how we would do a new game system that used skills better. I think that knowledge skills should be, I think that when you're designing your character, less skills, but then also you get to choose your tool proficiency, your knowledge proficiencies, and if you are a performer, your sort of art proficiency.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
And like, there's nothing saying that you can't be a fighter who plays the lute in the back of your caravan. And you took that as
Gurney from Dune.
Yeah, I think that there's a better way that this could be. And there are some games out there. I immediately think of like the way Call of Cthulhu sort of does. Yeah. You gain knowledge, but then you get to write what your area of expertise is. I like games that do that.
I mean, I think of Blades in the Dark where all the skills are very action forward.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that the more passive a skill is, the less reason it has to be a skill. Because to me, I want to see the players do a thing.
Yeah.
Rather than, and that is what prompts the die roll, rather than it be like a nebulous sort of knowledge sort of thing.
Well, it's almost like when you use the term skills, and you ask me, what are you skilled at? I'm skilled at creative writing, imagination. I'm skilled at guitar, maybe. But if you ask me, if I were to tell you that I'm really knowledgeable in film and television trivia, is that a skill? I don't think so.
No.
It's a knowledge. It's a special knowledge that I have. And so I think that the game could do a better job of differentiating what a skill is and what a knowledge is.
So up on screen, we'll show you our final rankings for all the skills in the game. So this is based, again, on our experience. You might have a different experience at your table in your games. Maybe you think we are completely off base on a few things. Maybe you completely agree on a few others. I do think it does vary from table to table, from DM to DM, which skills become more or less useful. But this is our cross-section based on our experience.
And so if you have different feelings at your table and your DM or you as a DM use some of these skills a lot more than we do, tell us about how you use them and why they're awesome in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. You can get on our Patreon-only Discord community by following the links down below.
And if you want to see us playing D&D and using a bunch of these skills or failing to, you can check out our actual play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings right here on YouTube. You can check out all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've tier ranked a whole bunch of other things in D&D, so check that out over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
In the dungeon.